The Joint Region Marianas Programmatic Agreements for testing and training are how we comply with the requirements of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. These PATs prescribe agreed-upon mitigations that apply to specific training activities. This training is required by everyone who participates in testing and training in the JRM area of responsibility. The presentation was developed in consultation with the Guam State Historic Preservation Office. Here is a look at the topics we will be covering in this presentation. What is a historic property? What is the National Register of Historic Places? What makes a historic property important? How does geology influence the type of sites found in an area? Overview of the history of the island, identifying artifacts and potentially significant sites, and what to do if you see something, say something. Historic properties is a term that defines a subset of cultural resources. While cultural resources include songs, dances, traditional arts and crafts, storytelling, and more, historic properties are associated with a location. There are 5 kinds of historic properties: archaeological sites, buildings, structures, objects, and districts. Districts can include any of the other 4 historic properties within the district. During construction, the main concern is archaeological sites that may not be known until dirt gets moved and reveals them. This slide explains the National Register of Historic Places and why it applies to management of historic properties. We are only concerned with listed or eligible properties. This slide shows some examples of internationally known historic properties: the Great Wall in China, the Pyramid in Egypt, House of Taga on Tinian, and Nan Madol in Pohnpei. These sites provide a connection to the past for indigenous people and aid in the local economies through tourism. The history of the Mariana Islands and its Chamorro people can be traced back more than 3,500 years. This history, from initial settlement through several colonial regimes to the present, has shaped the people, landscape, and seascape of Guam and its neighbors to the north. The Marianas should be viewed collectively because much of its history and culture was shared across all islands. However, geography, colonialism, and politics have separated the islands into 2 units: Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, or CNMI. As a result of these relatively recent historical factors, their modern histories and cultures have diverged. In discussing the history of the Marianas, historians and archaeologists typically divide the historical sequence into pre- and post-contact eras based on European contact with the Marianas that began with Magellan's 1521 arrival on Guam. This is further divided based on cultural milestones in Chamorro history and subdivided yet again into phases based on colonial-era events. Note that post-contact periods are based on colonial rule. Therefore, the histories of Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands diverge after the Spanish period at the beginning of the 20th century. The initial settlement of the Mariana Islands is believed to have occurred approximately 3,500 years ago. While the exact origin of these first settlers is hotly debated through analyses of pottery, linguistics, and DNA, the origins can be generally narrowed down to Austronesian people migrating from the Philippines and the islands of Southeast Asia. Radiocarbon dating prior to 1500 BC does exist for a few of the earliest sites, suggesting that initial habitation happened somewhat earlier. These early settlers were indisputably a maritime people, possessing the skills and resources to build large ocean-going vessels and to sail them on voyages of over 2,000 kilometers into prevailing winds and currents. These people settled the larger southern islands of the Marianas, living mostly along narrow beaches and unstable berms. Reflecting their maritime traditions and skills, early settlers built their villages along shorelines that offered access to ample fishing grounds and nearby fresh water. Over generations, these initial occupation settlements gradually expanded to encompass all of the Mariana Islands. For the first 2 millennia or so, the Chamorro people lived exclusively in villages along the coastlines of these southern islands. These people subsisted mostly on marine resources. Around 1000 AD, however, a population increase and a series of cultural changes took place, resulting in the expansion of settlements both inland across the southern islands and to the rugged volcanic islands to the north of Saipan. To support their increasing population, the Chamorro people began to farm starchy foods in inland areas of the islands and developed increasingly efficient ways to catch fish in larger quantities. These changes around 1000 AD coincide with the appearance throughout the archipelago of the distinctive stone columns with capstones, called ladystones, suggesting that the significant lifeway and cultural changes around this time are a result of a second migration of people to the Marianas. By 1700 AD, almost every inhabitable part of the Mariana Islands exhibited some form of human use. The maritime history and culture of the Chamorro people has remained a source of pride and tradition to the present day. The first settlers in the Marianas were undoubtedly of brave character and skilled shipbuilders, able to build and sail vessels 2,000 kilometers into the open ocean. A direct colonization of the Marianas from the Philippines, although other areas in the islands of Southeast Asia would be no less remarkable, would constitute the longest sea crossing undertaken by that time in human history and is a significant episode in the evolution of voyaging technology. Compared to the later population migrations of Lapita colonists into islands of Melanesia and West Polynesia around 1100 to 800 BC of around 900 kilometers, or the comparatively recent migrations of up to 1,500 kilometers into the rest of Micronesia and East Polynesia after 100 to 200 AD, the early and lengthy voyages to the Marianas were truly spectacular feats. More extraordinary feats of migration and navigation did not take place until 1000 AD, over 2,500 years later, when the long voyages of up to 4,000 kilometers finally settled the outer corners of the Pacific in areas such as the Hawaiian Islands, Easter Island, and New Zealand. This image depicts the general geology and hydrology of Guam. The northern Guam is porous limestone with no surface streams, while streams and springs are commonly on the volcanic soil areas of southern Guam. The center photo illustrates site formation processes where more recent material is typically closer to the surface than older material. There were no large animals on the island until Spanish brought them. Artifacts from pre-contact include shell beads, pendants, armbands, and rings made from shell. The Latte period is named for the two-part stone columns that supported buildings. Today, the stone columns are all that remains of the houses. These images depict both stone and shell adze blades, a replica of an adze, and a lusong, which was used to process food. There are smaller, portable versions as well. Activities and architecture from the Spanish era are represented in these images, including trade between islanders and visiting ships, a wall and bridge from Spanish times, a galleon, and murder of Father Salvatores, who was killed for disobeying one of the local leaders. Historic events, First American period, include the capture of Guam from Spain, a land show that was lived in until mid-20th century, the church at Sumai, destroyed during World War II. The village of Sumai was a prosperous village pre-war, A trans-Pacific underwater cable ran through the town and connected the U.S. with Asia. The Pan American Clipper flying boats stopped at Sumai, where a hotel provided a stopover for the flights. The town was evacuated when the Japanese captured Guam. Americans recaptured Guam, destroying much of the town in the process. Local residents were not allowed to return to Sumai, which was used to construct the naval base. Residents were resettled in Santa Rita, inland from the coast. Spain sold the Northern Mariana Islands to Germany, but when World War I started, Japan, as an ally of Great Britain, captured the Northern Marianas. Japan had developed business interests in the islands during the Spanish period. Japan, much closer to the Marianas than the European powers, poured people and resources into the islands. They invested in fishing, mining, agriculture, and construction. Much of the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and parts of Rota were cleared of jungle and sugarcane was planted. Sugar mills were planted on those islands. Garapan in the 1930s was a cosmopolitan city with restaurants, theaters, and other typically urban features. Japan also improved the Saipan harbor and built an airport, both of which would be useful during World War II. American ships arrived in the Marianas in the summer of 1944, capturing Saipan, Guam, and Tinian in that order. The U.S. then constructed facilities on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian to prepare for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. Some archaeological sites were damaged or destroyed by the war. These images demonstrate what archaeological sites look like in the field today. Upper left is an image of a pottery scatter. Upper middle depicts a lusong. Upper right is an artifact scatter. Lower left depicts a site that contained 19 lusong. Lower middle is an image of the remains of a laddie house. Lower right is a historic lancho or ranch. These slides depict the type of artifacts that may be encountered on the ground, indicating the need for avoidance and reporting to your training officer. The images depicted in this slide are examples of structural elements related to archaeological sites. Report encounters of this nature to your training officer. Notify your training officer immediately if you believe you encountered archaeological material. Your training officer will then contact the JRM Regional Environmental Coordinator, Mr. Mark Cruz, at mark.cruz@fe.navy.mil or 349-1104. Federal and Guam law requires DoD personnel to minimize impacts to archaeological sites. Training area maps are designed to avoid known archaeological sites. Please direct questions to the Joint Region Marianas Regional Environmental Coordinator, Mr. Mark Cruz, at mark.cruz@fe.navy.mil or 349-1104.